Hey guys, what's up? So in this video, we're going to look at API views in Django REST Framework. In the previous video, we went ahead and organized our app. We created a project as well as an app, which is for our posts. We also went ahead and installed as well as added Django REST Framework to our installed apps in our settings. Now let's just go ahead and create our first view. In Django, a view is a function that takes in an HTTP request and then returns an HTTP response. So let me show you a small example. So I'll go to our views.py within our posts app. And this is where we actually write our view functions. So let's just create a simple view that returns a JSON response. Now I'm just going to create a simple function-based view, and I'll call this, let's say, our home page. So this will take in a request, and then you have to define the type of this request. So Django requests are usually of type HTTP request. So I'm going to go ahead and import that. I'll say from Django.http, we are going to import the HTTP request class. And after importing the HTTP request class, I'll come and specify that this is going to be of type HTTP request. So once we have this, we also have to specify the type of response this is going to return. So normally in a Django view function, we return an HTTP response of type HTTP response. So let us go ahead and try to return a JSON response. So Django provides for us a class for which we can instantiate in order to return a JSON response. So I'm also going to import that class by coming and saying that we're going to basically return a JSON response, and then once I come here, I'm just going to simply come and return a JSON response, and this JSON response is going to be having data. So we're going to pass a kind of data that we can easily serialize, and I'm going to simply create our response. So I'll come here and say that we're going to have a response, and this is going to be a dictionary having a key of message, and we shall have the value as hello world. So right after doing this, I'll specify that the data we need for this response is actually going to be our response that we have set in our dictionary. Now that we have this, I'm going to simply go ahead and save. Now we need to map this onto a URL so that we'll be able to have our URL display our view function, or when we visit our URL, we actually need to trigger this view function. So I'm going to create a module within our post app, and I'm going to call this our urls.py. So urls.py is actually going to have our URL patterns. Now the way Django works is you create a view function and then go ahead and map that view function onto your URL so that you can be able to access the functionality of that specific view function. So I'll have to first import our views. So I'll say from dot, we are going to import our views, which is our views module right here. And then I'm also going to go ahead and import. So I'll come and say from Django.urls, we are going to import the path function. Now the path function is responsible for mapping a view function onto your URL, as we're going to see. Now, for us to have our URLs working, we need to have a list of URL patterns. So if you're wondering how I'm getting this auto completion, I'm using the Django extension. So I'm using the Django extension for VS Code. You can install it. It will give you some pretty nice auto completions, such as the one I've done for the URL patterns right here. So I'm going to go ahead and add some URL patterns. So I'm going to add the URL pattern. So the path function takes in the route. So we have to describe the route. And let's say this is actually going to be our home page. So let's just call it our home page URL. Then you have to specify the view functions. Now we have to locate the view for our home page. Now in this case, I'll say views.homepage, and then I'll give it a name. So the name is just going to allow us to access this when we maybe need to redirect to this URL, which we are going to look at. So in this case, I'll provide our name, and I'll say this is going to be our, let me actually call it our posts home. And once we have this, then the next thing we're going to do is to register these URL patterns for our posts app into our main project. So each time we have an app has its own URLs. Now, when you have our own, when an app has its own URLs, we have to go ahead and register those URLs into the main project folder. So we're going to go to our main project folder, which is our simple blog project folder right here. And then within our urls.py, I'm actually going to remove this comment. So we're going to begin by including our URLs. Now, Django provides for us a function that's called an include function, and the purpose of that include function is to help us to basically include URL patterns from other apps into our app or project. Now, what I'm going to do is to import the include function from django.urls. And right after doing that, I'll have to create a URL pattern specific to the posts app. So I'll do that with the path function. So this is going to take in the URL or the route as the first argument. So we're going to provide that route as posts, and then we are going to register our views, but instead of registering our view, we're just going to simply include our URLs for our posts app. So this is going to be done by including. So I'll come and say include, and then I'll locate our posts app, and then I'll refer to the urls.py module right here. So I'll come and say posts.urls and then save. So after saving this, we are going to try to make our request in this case. So I'm going to be using Insomnia as a tool for making my API calls or making our API requests. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my Insomnia. I'm actually going to leave a link down so that you can be able to download and install Insomnia. But you can feel free to also use Postman as your testing tool. Now that my Insomnia has been opened, I have this specific interface right here. I'm going to go to Insomnia. And then here I have my request collection. So we're going to be creating a new request collection. And this is going to be specific to our Django REST Framework course. So I'll just come and say Django REST Framework, and I'll call this course. So I'll go ahead and create this. Now, after creating this, we have this interface right here. So we have this specific button here. I'm going to click it, and then I'll create a new request. So I have to specify the name of the request. I'll have to call this get. Actually, let me just call it the post homepage. And once we have this, I'll basically say that we're going to make a get request, but you can also have the various other requests or the various other methods, the HTTP methods you can make for a specific request. So I'll go ahead and create this, and I'll have to provide the URL or the endpoint we are supposed to visit to make this request. So I'll provide this as localhost 8000. So this is going to be on our posts URL. So I'll come and say that we're going to have it on our posts, and then we shall say that we are going to provide this as /homepage because we actually called our URL /homepage. So I'll just come and say that we're going to have this as home page. Now, after having this as our home page, I'm going to send. And right now we see that we've got our message of hello world. Now this is enough, and you can be able to create a REST API using Django only without using any REST framework functionality. But the problem with this is we cannot be able to customize and take control of our requests. For example, each time we have our view function returning our response, we cannot be able to basically force our way into determining the status code that's going to be returned with this request. Now let's just go ahead and create the same API view by choosing Django REST Framework. So I'm going to be removing this for now. And if you're to notice, my code is actually not formatted. So I'm going to go ahead and install Black. So I'm just going to use Black throughout this entire project so that you guys can be able to view my code in a more organized way. So I'll press Ctrl and C, and then I'll install Black. So I'll say pip install, and then I'll say Black. So this is going to go ahead and install the Black code formatter within our project. And I'm going to also set format on save in my editor so that you can be able to format my code each time I save. So I'm going to pip freeze this to my requirements.txt file. And after doing that, I'm going to run our server again. And I'm going to pull up my settings. So in VS Code, the settings are found in control and comma. So I'll just come right at the top of our code and say we're going to search for format. So format on save is already set for me. Now this is actually going to work. So I'll close my settings for now. So this time when I go ahead and save our code, we expect that it's going to be formatting our code each time we save. Or actually, let me try to repeat setting the setting. So it's actually format on save. I'll click on this, and when I go ahead and save this, so let's try to make some changes to our file. So let us create an HTTP request or a view function or an API view using the same logic, but then with Django REST Framework. So in this case, we can notice that when we are creating a view function or an API view with Django only, we only require to take in an HTTP request and then return an HTTP response. But the difference is with Django REST Framework, we do this in quite a different way. So I'm going to be removing this for now. And what we're going to do is to create our view function using Django REST Framework. So the first thing we're going to do is to define our view function. So I'll just come right here and say that we're going to define this as our home page view function. So this is going to take in a request, but this request is not going to be an instance of the HTTP request from Django. So I'm going to import the request class from Django REST Framework. So I'll just come at the top of our code and then say from REST Framework. In this case, it's going to be .request. So we can actually see that REST Framework has modules for most of the things that we may need. So for example, if I said from REST Framework we can be able to see apps, authentication, auth tokens, checks, decorators, and so on. So in this case, we're going to access the requests, and we are going to import our request class. So when you have this request class, let me actually enlarge the text a little bit. So when you have our request class, we are going to specify that this request is going to be of type request, and then we're going to need to return a response. But the response in this case we're going to return is not the normal HTTP response that comes from Django. The HTTP response we're actually going to return is the one that comes from Django REST Framework. So I'm just going to come right here, and all I have to do is to import that request. So I'll say from REST Framework it's actually response. I'm going to go ahead and import our response class. Now the beauty with this response class is it can help us to basically customize the way we return our HTTP response. We can be able to determine the data we are returning. We can even return errors, and we can be able to do some other interesting stuff like specifying the status codes that we return for a given request. A response. So what I'm going to do is to just come right here, and I'll come and say return. So here we're going to return our response, and in this case we see that our response takes in data, and this data has to be JSON serializable. It also takes in a status, can take in a template name, headers, exceptions, and so on. So here we're going to determine the data we're going to return. So I'll just come right here and then specify that our response is going to be equal to a dictionary. So this dictionary is going to have a message, and in this case we're going to have our message as hello, and we shall have world. So we're going to determine the data of this response as our response, and then we are going to basically state the status code. So I'll come and say that our status is going to be equal to. Now another beautiful thing about Django REST Framework is it can help us to provide for us the status codes so that we do not need to create them ourselves, and we do not need to actually memorize them. So I'll come and import our status codes. I'll just come and say from REST Framework, we are going to import our status. And this is a module that contains all this HTTP status code. So we see that it returns descriptive HTTP status codes for code readability. So we're going to basically specify this, and I'll come and say status dot. So in this case, we can see the various HTTP status codes. Now, the one that you're going to access is going to be the 200. Okay. So this is the one that's returned for a successful HTTP response. Now I'm going to go ahead and save our code. I wonder why my formatting is not working yet, but I'm going to figure that out. So right now we've been able to change our view function. But for us to make this an API view as a function based view, we'll have to tell Django REST Framework that this is actually going to be an API view. Now, the way we do that is by using a decorator called the API view decorator. So I'll have to come at the top of our code right here, and then I'll have to say from REST Framework. In this case, we're going to access the decorators package, and I'll go ahead and import our API view decorator. So what I have to do is to come and say that we're going to access the API view, and actually we're going to decorate this as an API view. Now this API view decorator takes in the arguments of HTTP method names, and this specifies which kind of methods that you may need for a specific view function. So in this case, we're going to specify that this is going to take in a GET request, and let's say this is going to be the default HTTP method that you shall have for this view function. Now I'm going to go ahead and save, hoping that our server is running, which is running, so we don't have any errors. Now I'm going to go ahead and make this request again. So when you go back this side and we make our request again, we now see our message is being returned with an HTTP status code of 200. I think now you can get it, you can get how good it is to actually use Django REST Framework compared to building your API views with plain Django. So we've been able to look at how to create a simple API view with Django REST Framework. Now let's look at how we can be able to carry out post requests using our API views. So right now we've been able to specify that our HTTP method names are the GET request only. So which specifies that this API view or this particular endpoint of our home page is only going to allow us to fetch data or to be able to get data from our server. Now let's say we want to send some data to our server. Now we're going to add a post request, so I'm going to come and specify that we shall also have a scenario where we're going to send data to our server via a post request. Now what I'm going to do is to be able to determine or write the code that's going to determine what happens when we send data to our server via our post request. So using our request object that we specify within our view function, we can be able to keep track of the HTTP method that we use for a specific request. So I'm just going to come and say if request dot, in this case we shall have request dot method, and in this case if the request method is post. So what we're going to actually do is to access the data that we basically send with that request, or any kind of data that we may send with the request. We are going to say that the data is going to be equal to request dot data, and right after doing that, then we are going to return this data in our response. Now we're going to use our, so in this case I'm going to come and say that we're going to return our response, and this response is going to have our data. So we're going to determine our response. I'll just simply copy this exact response and paste it right in here. So we're going to basically change this. So we shall have our message as hello world, and then we shall have our data. So our data will just be the request data, or what we've specified as our data. So once we have this, I'm just simply going to come and say that our response is going to return our data, and this data is going to be equal to our response. Then we shall also have a status code. So in this case, let's say we are creating something, we can specify that our status code is going to be status.http then 201. Let's say we created a resource on our backend, and that will be http 201 created. So when I go ahead and save this, and then we go ahead and let's go ahead and actually make a post request based on what we've done here. So this endpoint will be able to carry out both a GET and a post request as we've defined in our HTTP method names. So I'm just going to come right this side, and I'll come and actually create a new request. So this request is actually going to be for a create, or let's actually say post request on home page. So this is going to be our home page, and this will be a post request. Now, each time we carry out a post request, we require to provide the body or the payload that we shall send with this request. And we're going to specify that it's going to be of a type of JSON. So I'll go ahead and create this. So we're going to specify our URL as localhost 8000 and then /posts/homepage. And we're going to come and provide our JSON body here. Now, let's say we are sending data over a username. And let's say this username is going to be, let me actually enlarge this so that you guys can see. So I'm actually going to enlarge this. So I'll provide our username as Jonathan. And when I try to send this, we actually see that our API is returning our data with that data that we sent with a request, having our username as Jonathan. Now, another thing we're going to try to do is to mock a simple or create a simple dummy database of posts. So the way we're going to do that is by creating a list, and this list is going to have dictionaries representing every post that we can have. That actually try to show us how we can have our posts in our real database. We're not going to be creating a simple database in this video. We shall create it later, but let's try to mock a simple database. So when I go back to our API code right here, I'm going to basically paste in a list of posts, and we have 3 posts for now. We have posts of ID1, ID2, and ID3. So let's actually see how we can be able to return these with an API view. So I'm just going to come right here, and all I have to do is to say at API view, then we're going to specify our HTTP method names. So this is going to be one for getting. And once we have this, I'm going to define our request handler function or our view function. And this is going to be our list posts. So this is going to take in our request that's going to be of type request. And once we have this, then I'll have to return our response. So this response is going to have its data. And our data in this case is actually going to be our list of posts. So I'll say that we shall have our data as list of posts, and then we shall have our status. And this status is going to be status.http 200. Okay. And once you have this, we have to create a URL for it. So I'll go to our URLs for our posts app. I'm going to first save that and then head over to our URLs of our posts app. So I'll create a path, and this path is going to be for I'll actually keep it to a blank URL since it's going to be on the root of our posts app. And then I'll create views dot, in this case it's going to be list posts, so I'll give it a name of list posts. And once we have this, then I'll go ahead and save. So let's try to actually return our list of dummy posts. So I'm just going to come and create a new request. So this is going to be for get all posts, and since this is a GET request, I'm just going to simply go ahead and create it. Now let's try to access it at localhost 8000/posts. And when you access this, I'm going to try to send. So this will return a list of posts. Now we've been able to return this as a list of posts. Now let's also implement an endpoint for returning an individual post. So what I'm going to do is to come to our views.py, and I'll have to create this as an API view. So this API view is going to have also a method of get. And then I'll specify that this is going to be a post detail view, which will take in a request as well. And then in this case, we want to actually return an individual post. So we're going to require to have an index of that specific post. I'll just come and provide it within our request handler function, or what we call our view function. So we shall provide our post index, and this will be an integer. So what you're going to actually do is to access this post by its index, and since we are having a list, we shall say that our post is actually going to be post, and then we shall say it's going to be post, and then we shall access by the post index. So if we have this post existing, then we are actually going to return the response containing that post. So we're going to say return our response, and in this case we shall say that our data is going to be equal to our post, and we shall have our HTTP status code of status.http 200, and then we shall say OK. And in case it does not exist, we are going to return our response, and this response is going to be our data. So this data is actually going to be containing an error. So once you have this error, then we shall say post not found, and then we shall return our status code of 404 not found. So I'll just come and say status.http should be 404 not found. And once you have this, let's actually go ahead and also create its URL. So I'll go to our URLs within our post app, and I'll create a new URL pattern, which is going to be path, and we shall have our path. So in this case, we shall provide our post ID. So I'll just come and say that we shall have our post ID as an integer. And once we have this, then we shall just add our views. In this case, we shall access our post detail. And now we're going to have our name, and this name is going to be post detail. So once you have this, let's go ahead and look at how we can be able to return this individual post. I'm going to save this, and when we go back right here in Insomnia, I'll create a new request. So this new request is going to be for get post by ID. It's going to be a get request. So I'll just come and provide a URL as localhost 8000/posts, and then we shall provide the index. So let's try to access that post at index 0. So when we send this, we're actually seeing post detail got post ID. Oh, I actually forgot that we are using post index instead. So I'm going to save this, and when I save and try to send this, we're actually returning our post at index 0. So when you return post at index 1, it's actually returning our post at index 1, and when you return post at index 3, it's actually returning. So this is actually list index out of range, which is actually not existing. So return post at index 2, we are actually getting our post. I hope you guys are getting what I'm doing at this point. We are not actually carrying out real database queries, but we are being able to return our post based on their indices. In this video, we've been able to look at API views in Django REST Framework. We've also looked at the advantages of using API views compared to using Django's default view functions for our APIs. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider liking, because it's going to help this video reach as very many people. Don't forget to subscribe if you're new. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video. Bye.